In 1996, I was the most popular voice in the world. You were playing Pokemon Blue. But for Paul Keating, he was conceding defeat to John Howard and bowling out of federal politics. What a suck.
Stuff you, Pokemon dude. You have no right to talk about Keating like that. In those 5 years in office, he changed the nation forever. I'll repeat forever. No matter how badly Howard tried, he couldn't undo the depths of reform that Keating had introduced.
To all those who have left nice comments thanking me for making unbiased videos, firstly, thank you. But secondly, I don't know where you're getting that impression. These videos are pretty damn biased. That being said, my pro-Keating bias today is probably more likely to annoy Labour voters than Liberal voters, and you'll see exactly why. Now, we left the end of the Bob Hawke episode with Keating finally toppling his master on the second attempt. For any of those wondering why he didn't just wait for Hawke to retire as the heir apparent, it's worth considering his background. Keating was tutored by none other than Jack Lang, as in the guy that nearly caused a civil war in the 30s, and this was the bit of advice given to Keating. They will say you have plenty of time, the truth is, you haven't a second to spare. And Keating himself said this: Dad had a stroke at 49, a coronary at 50, and died at 60. I don't know if I'm like him, but that's why I'm cranky with Bob. He slowed my schedule. So Keating entered office in 1991, probably doubtful he'd win the 1993 election, and so he sought to use his presumably brief tenure to transform Australia into a wealthy independent power. So I'll start with the real important stuff. Did the Queen get a curtsy when she was down under? So essentially, at the previous Labour Party conference, the sentiment within the party very clearly appeared to be pro-Republican. As a result, when the Queen arrived, she got a fairly muted greeting, and Keating's wife, Anita, declined a curtsy.
Mr. and Mrs. Keating, that is deeply improper.
Just as a side note, no judgment, but I'm really not that surprised that a marriage to Paul Keating ended in divorce. Can you imagine them fighting over who was supposed to do the dishes, and Keating whips out a, "If you think being on dishes on Sunday night means you shouldn't be on dishes on Tuesday night, you should hang your head in shame. Do the right thing and drum yourself out of this house." Now, after the Queen left Australia, Keating piped up about the fact that Britain deserted Australia during World War II and unfairly blamed Australia for the fall of Singapore. British tabloids started calling him the Lizard of Oz, and on Anzac Day of 1992, he visited New Guinea and kissed the ground on the Kokoda Trail.
Well, you Australians, you seem to have forgotten the fact that Anzac Day commemorates the Gallipoli landings when you were doing the bidding of the British.
Yeah, but that's exactly the point, Clarkson. Keating wanted to build a national identity away from the anglicised World War I, and instead around the Australians defending themselves from the Japanese in World War II. This also represented his broader mindset of moving away from the traditional Anglosphere and instead pivoting towards Asia. Now, last week, we saw Bob Hawke launch Apec, essentially an Asian Economic Cooperation Agreement, and Keating was very keen to build on this. Keating decided that his first visit would be to Jakarta to meet President Suharto, who also happened to be one of the worst genocidal leaders of the 20th century, but hey, the 60s was basically ancient history by then. Keating himself had never been to Indonesia before, but he viewed Jakarta as the most important alliance to have, and if you look at the map, it's not hard to figure out why. As Keating pushed to upgrade Apec, Bush Sr. was very much against this, but Keating decided to press on against American instruction. You can take the boy out of Bankstown, but you can't take Bankstown out of the boy.
Thank you guys for coming out to a night with the Clintons. Hey Bill, remember when Keating went behind our backs and met with President Suharto?
Oh, come on, Hillary. Keating was right all along. She's the future of the world, so that's why I had APEC here in Seattle.
Yeah, exactly right. Bill Clinton really liked APEC, but just wanted it to be on American rather than Australian terms, and invited all the APEC nations to come to Seattle. Keating was so passionate about the growth of APEC that he called Dr. Mahathir, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, a recalcitrant, essentially a 90s insult for a stubborn person. Now, Keating had a tough job convincing Australia of APEC because globalisation was associated with empty factories and Centrelink queues, as Australian companies used cheaper foreign manufacturing. And in the early days of office, the economy, kind of Keating's speciality, wasn't looking great. He'd campaigned on getting the quote-unquote country cracking, and with John Dawkins as treasurer, unemployment rose to 11%, and Keating's disapproval rate stood at 68%. Now, in fairness to Keating, that was less because of policy, and more because our grandmothers were watching new snippets of Question Time and thinking,
"Oh dear, but Keating is quite rude, isn't he?"
But the impacts of his economic reforms would outlast his time in office. In 1992, Keating introduced the Compulsory Employer Contribution Scheme, otherwise known as super. Now, I know it's a real Gen Y and Gen Z thing to zone out when your parents talk about your super, but it's so hard to understate just how important this reform was. Like many other Western nations, Australia was facing a demographic shift with an ageing population, and increased pension payments would put too much strain on the economy. The super scheme basically involved employers making compulsory contributions to employees' retirement funds. It was to start at a meagerly 1% of the salary in the 97-98 financial year, and would then rise a percentage point each year until it reached 15%. However, as we'll see soon, Howard froze it at 9%. Try as he may though, he couldn't actually kill it. Now, super was so important because the funds would stimulate the economy as portions of people's salaries were being invested rather than stored, and it enabled the working and middle classes to acquire wealth on a level unseen as their money was compounded in these funds. Anyone who went to high school between 2005 and 2015, check in with any teachers who retired in that era. They're on what we call the super duper super. A married couple of retired teachers I know live in a Sydney waterfront. That is how important that reform was. Now, unless you're Scott Morrison trying to keep the housing bubble afloat, there's no debating that this was one of the best policies a government has made in living memory.
No way, Mr. Mitchell. It's tyranny. You have no damn right to tell me what to do with my money.
But Ben, between 1991 and 1996, Keating fully privatised the state-owned Commonwealth Bank. He sold the first share in 1991 for $1.29 million, the second in 1993 for $1.7 million, and the last for $5 million in 1996. If you really think the government sucks at everything and the private sector is better, this should make Keating a hero of yours.
Thank you, Mr. Keating, for coming on the Sunday Special. It's always great when someone from the left comes on the show, even though it's worth noting you have a number of right-wing policies like corporate tax cuts, privatizing the Commonwealth Bank.
Politically in the Labor Party, I fought the left most of my life, always mostly on behalf of the United States.
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask is, what's with superannuation? Like, by any standard, that's government tyranny. If I lived in Australia, I'm getting a gun.
I'm surprised you even have the gall to stand up in public and ask such a question, frankly. You ought to do the right thing and drum yourself out of Australian journalism.
Speaking of, I'm making this a few days after Keating's appearance at the press club where he was really critical of Albo. If you were a Labor MP and Keating came back to challenge Albo for the leadership, who are you supporting? Keating or Albo? I'm also very tempted to make an alternate history video about what would have happened if Keating returned to politics after Rudd lost in 2013. But as Ben pointed out, Keating also reduced the corporate tax rate from 39% to 33%. Inflation was down to 1.9%, but unemployment still remained pretty high. Going into the 1993 election, again the one that Keating was expected to lose, Keating announced the introduction of a $6.5 million spending package. That would have a bigger impact on the economy than when Alex Ross brought a complete set of footy tazos to school in year 5 because his dad's mate worked for Smiths. There were literally 3 Peter Sterling Legend tazos in circulation after that point. Basically, it allowed everyone to have a good collection. Now, going into the 1993 election, it was looking grim for Keating. John Hewson was the leader of the Liberal Party, and from opposition, he launched the Fight Back campaign to address the unemployment issue and was the preferred leader. But given how savage Keating was in Parliament, Dr. Doofenshmirtz would have been the preferred leader.
Okay, that's Mr. Mitchell.
To make matters worse for Keating, Labor lost their state elections in Victoria and WA, and Keating himself made the prediction that he would lose. But in an effort that would make the young Liberals at schoolies proud, Labor won 80 seats to 65 and even had a swing go their way. Keating called it a win for the true believers, of which he wasn't really one of them. For John Hewson, this was simply a blow he couldn't come back from, and he was replaced with Alexander Downer. Now, Keating had also embraced the Indigenous Rights movement, giving his famous Redfern speech saying that we took traditional lands, and ultimately welcomed the Mabo decision to abolish terra nullius. In 1993, the Native Title Act had been passed, establishing the principle that Indigenous Australians were co-managers of the land. However, many refused to accept the decision, including Liberal WA Premier Richard Court. The Conservative premiers were proving to be a thorn in Keating's side, and they went to culture war issues to try and take him down, particularly Keating's idea to change the national flag. But as a culture warrior, Downer was pretty ineffective. However, the Libs had cycled between 4 leaders since 1989, and so dumping him probably wasn't the best look. But by 1995, with an election round the next year, Downer still hadn't made any ground in the polls. And so the Libs went back to the leader they dumped in 1989, John Howard. Now, John Howard thought he blew his one shot at the leadership after Andrew Peacock backstabbed him in 1989, and he was actually so hard hit by this that he admitted to going too hard on the drink. His autobiography is literally called Lazarus Rising, and so Howard couldn't believe that he'd been given a second shot. This time, he wasn't going to waste it, and he hit Keating hard on culture war issues, suggesting that any idea of an apology to Indigenous Australians was one that promoted a collectivist mindset. Even more so, Howard promised that the GST he'd once been keen to implement would never ever be a part of Liberal policy. We all have our carbon tax moments, right? And so in 1995, Canberra went to a by-election and there was a 16% swing against Labor with the Libs winning. As 1995 progressed and with a Liberal victory looking more and more imminent, Keating decided that he'd box Howard in on the Asia issue. Knowing that Howard was a staunch monarchist and he kind of saw how much of a US shill Howard would end up being, Keating used campaign time to instead fly to Indonesia to sign a security pact with Suharto. The best defence Australia could have was not in being a US ally, but in having the Great Wall of Australia. You know the story. Howard ended up winning comfortably in 1996, but no matter how hard he tried, Keating had already changed the nation forever. Keating had smashed a window in the Anglosphere that is only really starting to be recovered with AUKUS, as Treasurer to hawk his decision to float the Aussie dollar made us competitive in the global economy, and the introduction of super secured generational wealth for lower and middle classes. The media can be as smug as they want about this guy attacking character rather than policy, but when you change the nation as much as this guy did, you earn the right. Come back next week as we look at Nick Greiner set up the notorious ICAC and then be taken down by it. If you can't wait until then, watch this video on an even more corrupt Premier, Joe Bjoki Peterson.